Hey everybody, I'm Brian with Knox Company, and I want to show you guys how we did this backsplash on a budget. It was in a rental house that we were in while this house was being built. Because the landlord did not have a huge budget for it, I wanted to offer them the opportunity to have a upgraded look for a really low amount. I mean, I think we did the whole thing for under a couple $100, and really that paid for like the tile saw that I was using for it. It's a nice traditional subway tile look. It has an easy layout. It wasn't too many square feet, and this is where you don't have to go crazy with the type of material that you're using. We actually got these subway tiles at like Home Depot. They come in bulk. You can buy them for like under $1. I think it was like 40 or 50 cents a piece. And when you do the math and you start adding it all up, I mean, you're looking at the material cost for the tile being under $100. Then you're looking at your thin set, and if you have any tool rentals or if you have the tools, again, maybe a couple $100 total, hand tools, thin set, everything. So something you can do yourself, a project that you can tackle yourself. I'll walk you through all the steps. Because this is on a budget, we're not doing some crazy finishes with the Sluter edge, those metal edges. This is a technique that I've used on other places that is commonly found, not too super high end, but still a really good clean look. Gets the job done and definitely elevates your kitchen. So I'll show you guys all the steps here and you can follow me along. One of the first things you do want to do is figure out how much tile you need, what your square footage is. So measure the length plus the height, and then add another 6 inches or add another 10 or 20%. If this is your first time doing a tile job, you're probably going to make a couple mistakes. You're probably going to break a couple tiles, and you also just want to add for any of that cutoff. You're going to have some waste material. So it's always a good rule of thumb to add 10, 15, maybe upwards of 20% on the extra material, so that way you don't come into the problem where you run out of tile and for whatever reason they might not have it in stock again. So length times the height in inches or feet, calculate your square footage, and then you can go and buy the right amount of material that you need, and then you can also get the thin set appropriate. We usually go through a couple bags, so I always grab a couple bags, and also 10-15% extra in that tile. The next thing is also figuring out what type of spacing you want so you can get the appropriate spacers. These are really cheap. You can buy a couple bags of them, but we went with these 1/8" spacers, these little T spacers. The reason we're doing the T spacers is because I know that I'm going to be using a lot of these in all the different edges, because I can't get into the traditional square joints because we're doing a subway stack. So all my joints are going to look like a T or an L, but they make different types of spacers, different widths. And again, something that you can recycle for future jobs. They're very affordable. You don't have to throw them away, but you can buy a couple packs of them. And then also think about the style of tile and the layout. We are going for a subway look. So that has a 50% overlay. It's kind of like a brick stack, but whatever you decide, just make sure you get spacers that will work for you. One tip here is that the subway stack, because it is 50% over itself, when you have a window or you have a spaced opening like cabinets and you have an opening where an appliance is or something, you want to get the visual layout of where you start your first tile so that the layout and cut on either side of that window opening is the same, if that makes sense. So visually it looks symmetric. This is just the stuff that people notice when they go into a house or a renovation and they can tell that there was a lot of attention to detail. It's pre-planning where your tile is going to be and where your cuts are going to be. So you have to pay a little bit more attention when you're doing these traditional stacks like a subway stack or a soldier stack, because you're going to have an even spacing all the way across. And if you have 3/4 of a tile on one side of the window and a sliver on the other side of the window, your eyes will catch it. One way to avoid that is doing like a 30% offset, like thirds, 33%. It's kind of like a staggered stack. That way, visually, everything looks like it has its own off symmetry. Your eye won't pick up a larger piece here and a smaller piece there. So something to consider when you're thinking about how to stack or lay out your tile. Now, in this kitchen, we just got done replacing the cabinets, and I was telling them we could either replace the drywall, which is going to cost a couple $100 just to patch and repair the drywall, or because the drywall overall was still intact, no water damage, we could go and tile right on top of it. Now, because this tile is very light, we still used a thin set that has a polymer in it. The polymer additive is a couple dollars more per bag, but it makes it stronger, more flexible, because I knew I was going to be putting it right onto the drywall. If for whatever reason your drywall is damaged or it has no integrity and it needs to be replaced, you might want to put it with some type of fiberboard that's made for tile, but you can tile onto drywall as long as the job isn't too big and the tiles aren't too heavy. I may get some critiques on that, but for what this type of backsplash was and these really thin, light tiles, I just went with a stronger thin set, and I used enough thin set behind it to make sure that I had a good adhesion, and I knew that the material behind it had good strength, so we'd be fine with this type of small backsplash. Once you remove all your outlet covers and you pull out your outlets, if you need to, you can turn the power off to do this, but we want to remove all the casings that would be in the way, and then we're going to get ready to lay out our tile. Because this is a subway stack, we're going to have a lot of half cuts, so I already know that I can pre-cut a lot of these. I used a wet tile saw. I have a tile saw with a sliding base, probably one of the best upgrades that I ever got for tile work. I used to use one of the old $100 or $200, it's a wet saw, but you had to push the material through. It is night and day if you get a saw where the blade is fixed and the water runs over it and you actually slide the table through like the table's on a glide rail. It makes the job so much easier. So I would recommend getting in one of those. If you're not going to rent it, maybe own it. Do the math. If you need it for a couple days, the rental may be just enough to purchase. And then if you want to resell it, you could keep it, or you could resell it for probably at least half back, if not more. Or maybe you'll do another project in the future. So you can save your money by buying the tools here. And I would invest a couple $100 into that tile saw if you think that you might need to use it in the future. So like I said, the thin set that we're going to be using has a polymer in it, a little bit stronger base, a little bit more flexible, a little bit more grab. They use these for walls, not just flooring, but even some vertical or ceiling applications. So make sure the material matches your thin set requirements. But we're going to go ahead and mix this to a really smooth peanut butter consistency. I actually have a mud mixer tool, which is not a standard drill, but it's actually a heavy duty drill that's made to mix this stuff, because you can burn a regular hand drill. If you're doing a really small job, not too big of a deal. But if you're going to be mixing a lot of this thin set, I would recommend, again, renting or owning one of these thin set mud mixers, and we're going to mix it to a smooth peanut butter consistency. Now that we have our thin set mix, we can go ahead and start applying our first row of tiles. Here we're going to be doing it right above the backsplash that was already installed. So we have a small quartz backsplash that we'll just be building upon, and we're using that as our level, but otherwise we could go directly to the countertop. There's two different methods when doing this. You can back butter, which is actually applying thin set to the back of the tile and applying it to the wall. This guarantees you have really good adhesion to the tile and the wall. Or you can use a trowel with a big enough notch that allows you to put enough material on the wall so that when you push the tile onto it, you have good adhesion as well. So either or, depending on the size of the tile that you're using and the size of the trowel with the notch that you have, you can apply the appropriate amount of thin set to the back, but you want it to be grabbing across the whole back of the tile and the wall. And I personally kind of go back and forth between both techniques. It is really hard to apply the thin set on a trowel like underneath the cabinets. That's why backsplashes can kind of sometimes be a pain in the neck, literally. Depending on how much I have to do or specific areas, I may back butter, I may apply it to the wall first, or I may do both. Just kind of depends on the surface and how many I have to do. I have done a whole backsplash where every single piece I back buttered by hand. And these are not sheets of tiles, these are individual tiles, so that could be time consuming. But I made sure that I had enough material on the back of that tile so I will not have any problems in the future. Now we can go ahead and just make our progress down the wall using our spacers as we go. And probably one of the first hurdles you'll have is working your way around the window or underneath the stove or some type of appliance. There's a couple different techniques here, and this is where I was talking about spending that extra money, is how are we going to get the finished edge on these tiles around the end of the cabinets or the top of the windows or above or below, anywhere you have like an exposed edge. This is where they do sell some upgrades like Schluter. That's actually the name brand. It's a metal edging, and you place this underneath the edge, a small gap around the perimeter, and it kind of gives you a metal finished edge so you don't see the end of the tile. That is a little bit more money. It's not a lot, but here we were just kind of really trying to keep it on a budget. So we're just going to be able to set these tiles and actually finish with a small little bit of grout, which is accomplished by putting a little piece of tape there, just like we would do to protect the wall from caulking and kind of give you a clean edge. And we put the grout along that edge and then peel it back. And then as we brush it away with the sponge, it kind of leaves just a little bit to kind of give you that transition from the tile to the wall. But around the window, again, we're just going to kind of meet these edges in a corner. We're going to be finishing these edges with grout, and it's going to give us an easy transition, and it will still look really nice. The other area is like behind a stove. What I did is I moved the appliance out of the way and I put a small ledger board right below the countertop line. That way I knew exactly measuring up where my tile would need to be to line up with the tile that was coming across. And I would have a support so that as I lay my first row of tiles and I start to stack those other tiles on top, I can build up to the height that I need and not have everything sag on the wall. Small cut of wood, make sure it's level. I secure it on the wall. Then I can build my tile across that and then obviously remove that ledger board when I'm done. But this is just to create like a bridge or a support while you're coming across an area that has no baseline, like the countertop or the backsplash in this case. Whenever you need to make any notches for the outlets or corners, you can do this again with the tile saw. You can mark out the areas measuring across and up to see what part needs to be cut out. And you can either use 2 straight cuts, or you can actually take multiple cuts with the wet tile saw and then use the edge of the blade to kind of press across it, and you'll see the pieces just kind of pop out. And you can lightly use the edge of the blade to kind of curve or grind away the edges to work it down to the exact measurement that you need. You'll get a feel for this as you use the tile saw. It's not too complicated, but it's something that you might need to practice with. And again, that's why we bought 10 to 15% extra, so we can use some scrap or afford to waste a couple pieces. So now that we have everything up, we have all of our spacers in, we're gonna let this sit for about half a day or so. We wanna make sure that thin set behind it sets up, and then we can start removing those spacers. There's a time frame between 12 hours to 18 hours, depending on your temperatures there, that we want to remove those spacers so that we can get any of that material that may have gotten on the tile, because it is a little messy. You can take a wet sponge and lightly go over the surface and clean off anything around the edges. And you can also take a razor blade, which I usually do, and I'll lightly run it through the grooves of the tile to remove any excess thin set that may be protruding, because we want to fill those voids with grout. Within the first, I would say, 18 hours, you want to go back to this tile, remove those spacers, and start cleaning up the face of the tile. Clean as you go, that way you don't have to scrub it really hard later. Within the first 24 hours, 18 hours, the material is really easy with a lightly damp sponge. Run it across the face of the tile and the material should come right off. That way we are starting the grouting process with very clean tile and open spaces for the grout to go into. So now we're ready for the grout. And we went with like an off-white, something that didn't overpower the white of the tile. That's one thing we didn't want, is the grout to be brighter than the tile. And when we're mixing this, we are going to, again, mix it to a peanut butter consistency, if not slightly wetter, like a little bit creamier. This material needs to be workable, and it's similar to back buttering or even putting the material on the backsplash. We are going to work it in at different angles, crisscross, slide it, work in small areas, work your way across the whole entire backsplash. If for whatever reason you find yourself working through the backsplash and you're about an hour into it and you haven't had a chance to go back where you started with a wet sponge, you might want to consider stopping or getting some help, because this is where you do not want the grout to dry for too long. Like I said, within about an hour or so. I like working with a little bit wetter material, so I have maybe a little bit longer working time. But work in small areas, and you can lightly go back over the surface with a very, very lightly damp sponge. This will remove any excess material on top of the tile, and it will save you some work afterwards, because the last step is wiping the final coat of that stuff off. And if there's too much on there and it's dry, again, you'll find yourself scrubbing really hard. So work your way through the backsplash, intermittently going back and kind of wiping down the tile. Be careful not to remove too much material. If you see that the material is coming out as you hit it with that damp sponge, let it sit, because that means it hasn't firmed up yet and you still have some time to go. Clean as you go, and then as we go to this last step, I'll show you the technique that is very important to make sure that we don't get foggy or hazy tile. The last and final step is going back over this with a clean water damp sponge, very lightly damp, and this is a single pass. And when I say single pass, I mean single pass. Don't get greedy. This is time consuming, but it pays off, because then you won't have foggy, hazy tile where you have to go back later with a scrub and cleaner and try to clean off this residue. So after this stuff is sat, after grouting, and you've kind of done your first initial wipe just to get the bulk material off, we let it sit. Let that grout start to sit. Then you go back with clean water and a clean sponge, wring it out as much as you can, very, very lightly damp. Do one pass. You can see there's some residue. Other side, one pass, and then rinse it again. Don't use too much water, because the grout's not fully set. If you get it too wet, might start to pull out from the lines. So very lightly damp, single pass, rinse, and repeat and repeat and repeat. You will see that there's a very, very light residue. And eventually, if you were to go over this 2 times, front to back, and then go all the way back where you started, it should be dry. You'll see that there's less or no more residue. This makes sure that you don't have that haze that sticks on there when we're done. And once you've completed this process, we are pretty much done with the whole thing. You may or may not want to, a day or two later, go over this one more time with like a wet, damp rag, just to kind of get anything that might be left. But because you did such a good job with the sponge, it won't be sticking and it will come right off. And that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and you guys didn't find that too confusing. I know it might sound like a lot if it's your first time, and if it's not your first time, maybe you learned something and it's something that you can practice, do it yourself, save yourself some money and take some pride in your work. But it's definitely something you guys can tackle. You can rent the tools, you can buy the tools, maybe you have a friend or a buddy who you can borrow them from. But the biggest investment for me was upgrading my wet tile saw, because I end up doing tile work pretty often, so it's nice to have those things. Same process is very similar to flooring. I do have another video where we did the backsplash at this house, and we didn't want the builder to do it because it was so expensive to have somebody else do it. So I definitely wanted to tackle that, and I have all the footage that I'm going to be putting together showing you a little bit higher upgrade backsplash, a little bit more complex in the layout. This one walks you through all the steps. Definitely something you guys can do. If you guys have any suggestions or anything you want to see, let me know. If you have any questions about the process, definitely leave me a message there in the comments. I'm really good at getting back to all those, and I appreciate all the feedback. But once again, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you on the next build.